no contemporary discussion of conspiracy would be complete without an unhealthy dose of cyber scaremongering, which, for the purposes of this panel, I'm going to define as the belief that political phenomena that we've all been perfectly familiar with for many decades, like political advertising or protest, suddenly becomes a threat to civilization itself when it's mediated online. Having said that, the online world does bring with it some distinctive issues, not least is a pervasive insecurity online. We're just waking up to the fact now, I think, like what a dangerous combination online insecurity is with the voracious data harvesting tendencies of the big internet companies and online advertising, both to the security of personal data and individual political autonomy. The legal regimes set up to deal with these issues, cybersecurity laws and computer crimes laws, are either ineffectual or more often actively counterproductive when it comes to dealing with these important issues. In fact, criminalizing the groups in society who are best equipped to help us deal with them. They have a disproportionate impact on political speech, security research, and journalism. This year, we've seen a whole host of quote-unquote cybersecurity laws passed in countries like Kenya, Honduras, and Vietnam, which have among their specific objectives the limitation of political speech. We cannot have this conversation without acknowledging the disproportionate influence the United States has in this area. The treatment of hackers under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the United States is unparalleled in its severity. The prosecutorial system, plea bargaining, sentencing policy, and prison conditions have caused a significant amount of harm to hackers, journalists, and others engaging in political speech over the past decade, and some members of this panel can testify to that at first hand. In addition to criminalizing its own hackers, the United States has a significant influence on the content and implementation of laws abroad. And more than that, they reserve the right to reach out and impose their own laws on individuals based in other countries extraterritorially. This is a constantly evolving area. The application of US laws to people based in the UK took a blow earlier this year when my learned friend Lauri, sitting at the end of this panel, resisted the prospect of extradition to the United States and won his case at the High Court. But the domestic penalties available to British authorities are becoming ever worse, and the CPS is throwing national security charges around with wild abandon at the moment, exacerbating the problems of a legal regime which UK police, if you get them to speak, off the record, will admit is already overbroad in its application, dragging in with a disproportionate impact on the young, the neurodiverse, and the politically vocal. According to the National Crime Agency's own data, the average age of people getting arrested on computer crimes charges in the UK is 17 and falling. We have a really impressive panel today to discuss these issues. Lauri, who I've already mentioned, Mustafa, Al-Bassam, who have direct experience of this at the sharp end. Barrett Brown in the United States will hopefully be joining us.
It's him.
Yes.
Hi, Barrett.
Here you are. And Gabriella Coleman, who you've heard before and has written about these issues probably more extensively than anybody else.
Great.
So, Mustafa.
So first of all, I'd like to start off by saying I think the name of this panel is pretty bad. The name of this panel is Cybercrime and IRL Punishment, and I think that's really missing the point. Like, this is a panel effectively about how the state treats hacktivists and hackers and people who use hacking as a means to uncover truth. And so, and if you look at the description of this conference, it says that this is a conference that brings journalists, whistleblowers, and hackers together. So I think calling hacktivists cybercriminals at a conference about hacktivism is a bit like calling journalists cyber shitposters at a conference about journalism.
That's it.
But with that out of the way, quick background on myself. So when I was a teenager, I was involved with a bunch of hacktivist groups, specifically Anonymous and LulzSec. And we hacked into a large amount of US governmental and corporate organizations. One of the things we did, for example, is we hacked into a US defense contractor called HB Gary Federal, which was later found out to be from our leaked information, and thanks to Barrett Brown's work as well, to have this plan with Palantir to blackmail American journalists like Dan Greenwald so that they can discredit WikiLeaks and to feed this information in WikiLeaks and whatnot. And so when we published that leak, as a result of our hacking, there was a US congressman that wanted to launch an investigation into that in Congress, and also the CEO of the company resigned. And we also were involved with the Arab Spring, leaking various emails from various organizations and also defacing, for example, the website of the Prime Minister of Tunisia. And then there's also some fun stuff we did, like, for example, we planted a fake news article on PBS saying that Tupac was still alive in New Zealand. And but what I would like to do today is talk a little bit about our persecution and how the state, particularly the US and the UK state, dealt with us. So it was a fairly long legal process. I think I was arrested when I was about 16, just after I finished my GCSEs, and I was sentenced when I was 18. And part of the condition of my bail was that I was not allowed to use a device that had access to the internet. So if I did, I would have to go to jail. Now, I think if you look at the way that this persecution was handled, there was many criminal actions actually committed by the UK and the US prosecution. And I would like to do a BuzzFeed-style top 5 ways that the UK and the US governments performed criminal activities while investigating the hacktivist groups of Anonymous and LulzSec. So number 1, in our group, there was a person who was later turned into an FBI informant who went by the name of Hector Monsegur. Well, that was his real name. His online nickname was Nick Sabu. And he was flipped over by the FBI, and he became an informant sitting on the hacker chat rooms for about 2 years. And he wasn't simply just sitting on the chat rooms and logging everyone's chats. He was proactively participating in those discussions with all of those hackers. And on many, many occasions, he actually encouraged people in those chat rooms to hack into foreign governments, such as Brazil, Syria, Pakistan, Iran, and many other governments.
I might say beyond encouraged, potentially orchestrated.
Yeah, I would say he orchestrated is the correct word as well. He would actively go into these chat rooms under the watch of the FBI, and he would paste links into those chat rooms to these websites, to URLs that are potentially vulnerable to things like SQL injection, and he would tell people in the chat room, hey, look at this link, it's potentially vulnerable, you should try hacking into it. And this was all done under the watch of the FBI. So apparently when teenagers or young people hack into governments, they get jail time, but apparently it's okay when the FBI encourages the FBI informant to do it. He wouldn't go to jail.
Including to foreign government victims.
Exactly. So that's number 1. Number 2, so the way that the UK governments were investigating Anonymous and LulzSec was quite interesting. Because when we were indicted in the UK, our indictment was fairly odd compared to other indictments in the sense that it doesn't actually specify any evidence of how they managed to discover our offline identities from our online identities. Because obviously we were trying to be anonymous online, using Tor and whatnot and masking our IP addresses. And they didn't present any evidence whatsoever how they actually managed to discover our real identities. So until 2014 came along, and there was an article published on NBC based on a document leaked by Edward Snowden from GCHQ that revealed that GCHQ were actually targeting using surveillance programs to investigate the Anonymous and LulzSec. So that made a lot of sense because they were using these illegal mass surveillance programs to investigate people in these chat rooms, and then they use a form of parallel construction to. When they arrested us, they took our laptops, and then they used a form of parallel construction to prove that we were our online hacker handles. So number 3, one of the things that GCHQ also did during 2011, GCHQ launched a denial of service attack against an IRC chat room that Anonymous was using. And this wasn't like a illegal, online chat rooms aren't illegal. Like this was a online chat network that many people use. I think there was like 1,000 people on this network. So it wasn't just used by illegal hackers, it was used by legitimate activists and friends as well. And they launched a denial of service attack against this IRC network to shut it down. Now, now under the Computer Misuse Act, the denial of service attack is against the law. And the deep irony here is that one of the people who were arrested in Anonymous, Christopher Weatherhead, actually went to jail for 2 years for doing the exact same thing against PayPal. So that's deeply hypocritical and tyrannic. And GCHQ is not exempt from the Computer Misuse Act. They're not allowed. It's against the law for them to hack as well. So in 2015, Privacy International, which is an NGO based here in the UK, actually launched a lawsuit against GCHQ in the Investigatory Powers Tribunal for a different case where GCHQ had hacked into a foreigner's computer. And in theory, the judgment wasn't supposed to be for GCHQ because GCHQ is not exempt from computer hacking laws. But just a few hours before the judge released the judgment, the UK government changed the Computer Misuse Act to add an exemption to the Computer Misuse Act to exempt GCHQ from computer hacking. There was no debate about this. There was no parliamentary debate about this. There was no democratic debate at all. They just simply pushed this without going to Parliament, exempted GCHQ from this law, added like a little sentence to the act, 3 hours before the judgment was released. How is that democracy? So number 4. So in 2013, I was arrested for allegedly breaking my bail conditions because allegedly I used the internet. And so there was a judge in the Crown Court, Southwark Crown Court, who revoked my bail and so sent me to jail for allegedly breaking my bail conditions.
It's worth mentioning you were under the age of majority at the time.
Yeah, I was under 18 at the time. And I went to Feltham's Offender Institute. And my lawyers were very smart in this case because they actually there was actually the way that the judge did it, the way that the judge actually sent me to jail was actually illegal. So the lawyer in the case, my lawyer, applied to the Royal Courts of Justice to argue that this imprisonment was illegal. And the Royal Courts of Justice actually declared that I was being illegally imprisoned and had to be released. And the prosecution and the Royal Courts of Justice were pretty pissed off at the prosecution. And so I was released, and I had to spend 2 years in jail. And as a result, I missed my maths exam, and so I got an A instead of an A star.
Poor lad.
So I had to go to King's College London instead of UCL. So, that's number 4. Now, in number 5, in 2011, a bunch of some hackers actually managed to hack the police department, I think, in Ireland or in the UK, I'm not sure of the details, that were investigating Anonymous and LulzSec. So they had hacked into the police emails, and they had discovered that there was going to be a conference call that was going to be between the UK and the US prosecution and the FBI to discuss our case. Now, because there was an FBI informant sitting in this hackers' chat room, the police knew that the hackers hacked into the emails and were going to be listening into the conference call. So they went ahead with this conference call anyway, with the knowledge that it was just a ruse and that they were being listened to. But the hackers didn't know that. Now, one of the conditions in the UK when someone under 18 is arrested is that you're not allowed to publish their name or tell anyone their real name, and the media is not allowed to publish their name. So I was totally anonymous to the media when I was under 18. Now, during this conference call, even though that the police in this conference call knew that they were being listened to by people that were going to leak the call, they said my real name in that conference call, knowing that it was going to be leaked. Mm. So that's number 5. So to sum up, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to the way that that governments prosecute hackers. And I think, as we've seen with the cyber case, a lot of this isn't really about upholding the law. It's more about politics. Like when you have a situation when teenagers are going to jail for hacking governments, but apparently the FBI is allowed to do it, is allowed to tell an FBI informant to encourage young people to hack into foreign governments, and that's totally okay. I think clearly this isn't really about upholding the law anymore. And I think we've seen this specifically with a sentencing recently, with a young man called Kane Gamble, who was 16 when he was arrested. He was prosecuted for hacking into the CIA director's emails, and what he did basically was he basically allegedly blackmailed the director of the CIA to say that if you don't stop the occupation of if you don't stop encouraging Israel to occupy Palestine, basically, then I'm going to release your emails. And so, as a result of that action, the judge in the UK called this 16-year-old person a cyber terrorist for blackmailing the CIA, which is, I think deeply hypocritical, because the CIA wrote the handbook on blackmail.
Yeah, Kane Gamble's case is actually one of the cases I'm aware of where the CPS has actually tried to land this sort of this new national security charge they have.
Yeah.
So it's one of these cases where, yeah, the reaction is entirely disproportionate. I wonder.
While we're airing laundry lists of grievances against the criminal prosecution of subversive, undesirable elements using technology, aka hacktivists, I have a few stories to relate. I've got a friend who's a journalist, but to make a bit of extra money, she sometimes helps find people to do stories for Glossies or the Daily Mail or something like that, obviously contrived about having relationships with supernatural entities. And sort of feels like over the last 4 years, I've been in a weird relationship with the spirit of Franz Kafka. And how can I, so a few examples. I have never visited the United States of America. I've not had that dubious privilege. Haven't actually left the UK since 2008 when I went to Finland, where I have dual nationality. Regardless, in October of 2013, parcel turned up at my door, and a guy in a UPS delivery outfit bearing the parcel, ostensibly, and I was, asked to come down in my dressing gown to accept this parcel. Instead, I got a surprise, and 12 people from the newly formed National Crime Agency came and ransacked our house. And after a 5-hour search and seizure of every digital device in the house that could possibly store data, I was arrested under the Computer Misuse Act for alleged involvement in a hacktivist campaign, which is alleged to have targeted a lot of US government computer networks of some note and importance, shall we say, including the FBI and the Federal Reserve Bank and Department of Energy and the Pentagon and a lot of things. Anyway, they read out a long list of things, and I expected to be charged under the law of the country that I live in, by virtue of the dubious social contract I never signed when I was born here. Rather than that, I was kept on bail for a few months and served with a really fun piece of paper that reads, under Section 49 of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, 2001, you are compelled by the Central Court, the Old Bailey, to facilitate, I'm paraphrasing now, to facilitate the decryption of data seized from devices in your property. And I had originally a week to cough up all of these magical passphrases so that the National Crime Agency could convert some ones and zeros, which were unfortunately for them not incriminating, into what they were hoping would be a different set of ones and zeros that would be highly incriminating, and it was for me to facilitate this process. I didn't feel compelled, but theoretically I could have gone to jail for 2 years just for using strong cryptography, or them claiming that I use strong cryptography and not necessarily having to prove that I could help out with that. So that was a bit Kafkaesque. I didn't comply, and possibly as an indirect consequence, or more likely because the United States never intended, in my case, conversely to Mustafa and Jake's, to actually prosecute under UK law, maybe because there would have to be an open trial, and maybe because evidence would have to be contested and witnesses would have to be produced. They'd much rather that I be extradited to the USA, where, as Barrett may be able to tell you more about, not that many people go to trial in the federal criminal justice system. Approximately 97% of federal criminal defendants plead guilty, and they don't plead guilty because they get religion and out of their conscience and they feel bad. They plead guilty because of the prosecutorial discretion to stack charges and the absolutely absurd sentencing guidelines and sentencing culture in the US and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, being a little bit ambiguously defined, meant that in my case, illustratively, I could have been facing a maximum of 99 years in a small box in the country that I have never been to for crimes under a law that somehow extends beyond the lovely boundaries of the United States to the internet at large, and that has been the default position of the Department of Justice. We can prosecute what we believe to be violations of our law on the internet. So to make a long story somewhat shorter, after losing at Westminster Magistrates Court, and potentially facing this prospect of being extradited, not to just one state of the United States, but having the very dubious, I think unique privilege of being extradited concurrently to 3 separate US federal court jurisdictions, which I don't think they've even done for actual terrorists that blow things up, or Pablo Escobar. But what it meant in this case was, even if I was 100% certain I'd win in New Jersey, a wonderfully non-corrupt court system, they could keep me in pretrial detention, because if you have to be kidnapped, you're considered a flight risk. It's weird. So you don't get bail, and I could win one case, be detained, go to another case in the Southern District of New York, another great jurisdiction. You might remember them for successfully prosecuting no bankers from the financial crisis. And if I won that, I would go to the best court of all in the District of East Virginia, also known as the Rocket Docket. It's a very efficient court. It's in the Beltway. Everyone on the let's pretend I would have had a day in trial and a jury. They'd all work for the military-industrial complex. So my expectations of due process in the United States were slim, and we elected to fight the extradition. You can actually consent to extradition. I don't think it's very common. We elected to fight it, and on appeal, thanks in part to the legacy of Gary McKinnon, who had a 10-year legal struggle against extradition, also for allegedly hacking into NASA, also not for traditional, shall we say, criminal intent of self-enrichment or destructive or malicious, but for a kind of activist-y, let's uncover information in the public interest purpose. He was eventually saved by Theresa May, Prime Minister, I think still, for whatever it means, in the one good act that she ever did in her political career, I think we'll all agree. And then they changed the law so that there is this forum bar, and you can say, hold on a minute, maybe we have functional enough courts system to prosecute my friends and colleagues here, and perhaps it should be done here. We did eventually successfully convince, thanks to the efforts of Naomi and a very wide campaign of support, including somehow 114 members of parliament who signed a letter, and then nearly the same number who signed another letter. First letter went to my good friend Barry Obama, who unfortunately at the time had a lot on his plate. Donald Trump having won, in inverted commas, the presidency. So we didn't get a response from him, and then another letter was sent to America to, the Attorney General or something. But anyway, so thanks to this political acknowledgement of maybe it's a bit worrying that a person gets taken to a place they've never been to be locked up for the rest of their life for alleged involvement in non-violent protest. The campaign was after the tragic death of Aaron Swartz, who was an amazing internet legend, advocate of open information, and should not have been driven to death for very dubious, cruel purposes, again, as a figurehead of a movement for liberties on the internet. And we managed to successfully convince Judgy McJudgeface, more properly titled the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, Ian Burnett of Malden in Essex, and Lord Justice Ouseley, who were finally of the opinion that yes, the forum bar should be applied, that it is in the interest of justice after balancing 5 different tests. Not that there is no prosecution, which is often the alternative to extradition is impunity. In this case, it's a matter of where the case is prosecuted. So the High Court's orders has the judgment that the Crown Prosecution Service should bend its endeavours towards the prosecution of me here in the UK under UK law. So that's what we're waiting. And again, in a kind of Kafkaesque manner, I have to now cheerlead my own prosecution because it turns out the National Crime Agency never got around to, perhaps because of this cryptography issue, finding any evidence that I was involved in any hacktivist campaign. And the extradition treaty is peculiar with the USA, thanks to Tony Blair being a warmonger chum with a warmonger called George Bush, and David Blunkett being, I don't know, just an idiot or something. But anyway, the USA never has to never has to produce a single shard, a single shred of evidence that a requested person committed the crime, the prima facie case, as we call it, reasonable grounds to suspect that person. They don't even have to establish that a crime was committed, and they can certainly pull numbers out of where the sun doesn't shine, such as $60 million, which at some point I was supposed to owe the US government, and they're not going to get it. So it was completely evidence-free, and as a consequence of that, I still have not seen any evidence that I was involved in this crime, neither has the Crown Prosecution Service, and I've got to somehow convince the FBI that they would, being so aggrieved at the terrible civil disobedience against their government, that they would like to cough up some evidence so that I can be taken to court in the UK, not because I really want to go to a slightly better prison. I already went to one briefly after the extradition arrest, and it was run by Serco, and they imprisoned me under a name, an identity that doesn't even exist. They got my name backwards. So there is a Love Lauri that is on the UK prison system. Lauri Love has never been to prison, so I can legitimately deny that in job interviews. But we also won a minor victory for cryptography, for the presumptive right that you can store data securely, in that I still haven't got my property back from the National Crime Agency, and I sort of asked them very nicely, even suggested mediation through some mutual friends, the special constable that did the forensics to help lock up Mustafa. And in the end, I ran out of nice ways of asking, and I went to the magistrates' court laden information under really obscure 1897 bit of legislation called the Police Property Act. Sort of says to the effect of, if you nick someone's stuff because you want to look through it, because you want to chuck them in a small box, it doesn't mean it's your stuff. Eventually, when you have looked at it enough, or in the case of digital evidence, when you have imaged it and made a copy, that property still belongs to the suspected person, because guess what? We live in a system where you have rights to property. And in my case, they refuse to return it and still refuse to return it because there are bits they can't read. So it is worrying if the presumptive right to property is reversed, if it now becomes, in a digital age, contingent on the state being able to read it all, understand it all, and maybe put you in prison for some of it. And as potentially journalists or civic-minded people, you should be worried about this. At least now, I won a victory in the case management of that Police Property Act. It's still not got to the full hearing because I've been really nice and kicked it in the long grass until we won the extradition case. But they tried to stop there even being a hearing by setting a direction that I would have to give the passwords. You can't even ask a judge whether you have a right to property unless you compromise your own security. So that wasn't allowed, and I get to go to court in December to continue that case and hopefully get my property back. So that's still open-ended. But yes, I'm in this weird position where I have to cheerlead and potentially facilitate and bully the CPS into taking me to court because as things stand, I can't leave the country at the minute, and the country for this purpose is England and Wales, because Scotland have their own court system, and Gary McKinnon couldn't even go to Glasgow to see his dying father in hospital because his lawyer, his solicitor, my solicitor, rightly advised him, if you go there, another warrant can land in the Scots court system, and you can be screwed over for another couple of years. So I'd like to go to Finland to visit my family. I'd like to go to Berlin to do some hacking work and I can't. So I've got to go to court so I can leave the country. So those are my grievances, subset of them.
Thank you, Lauri. I was wondering if I could invite Barrett to join in with this airing of grievances, but by no means feel restricted to that.
Certainly, I will not feel restricted. I want to start by going into as context for why all these things are happening and why the stories you're hearing about what happened to us, why they happened. And this goes back to what it was that we discovered back in early 2011 during this altercation that Mustafa mentioned earlier between Anonymous and HB Gary Federal and a number of firms involved with HB Gary Federal, as well as the Department of Justice. Team Themis was the name of this consortium of firms. It included HB Gary Federal, Barrett, Endgame Systems, and Palantir, which itself has become much more prominent in recent years. And we'll get back to that in a second. They put together some proposals for Bank of America and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And this was facilitated by the Department of Justice itself. Bank of America was worried about WikiLeaks having gained information about their own wrongdoing. And so because the Department of Justice is a sort of concierge service now for criminal corporate actors, the Department of Justice said sure, we'll help you out. And they put them in touch with this consortium of black ops firms run by ex-intelligence people, ex-military people in the U.S. And so the proposals that they created to win this account for the Bank of America and U.S. Chamber of Commerce included the following potential steps to take against their perceived adversaries. Regarding a left-wing group that documents the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's influence on Congress and otherwise engages in entirely legal, journalistic, and activist activities, Team Themis proposed the follows, quote, create a false document, perhaps highlighting periodical financial information, and monitor to see if U.S. Chamber Watch, which is the name of one of these left-wing groups, acquires it. Afterward, present explicit evidence proving that such transactions never occurred. Also, create a fake insider persona and generate communications with U.S. Chamber Watch. Afterward, release the actual documents at a specified time and explain the activity as a Chamber Watch contrived operation, unquote. In other words, the intent here was to release documents to this group using insider personas, which is to say infiltrators, using fake names, fake backgrounds, encourage them to release this document to the public as something that U.S. Chamber of Commerce had and that showed wrongdoing on their part, and then have the U.S. Chamber point out the document to be false and claim that this activist group had fraudulently created these documents, which potentially would set them up for fraud charges. When I say potentially, I mean definitely. This was just one of a number of not just unethical and disingenuous, but sometimes criminal activities that these firms were proposing to engage in on behalf of powerful entities. This came out, of course, because Mustafa and Jake Davis here and a few others they hacked into, I'm told by the authorities, they or their alter egos were involved in a hack into HB Gary Federal and disseminated these emails that showed a number of other projects and programs, just basically illustrated what it is these intelligence contracting firms in the U.S. mostly, what it is that they do, and how illegal they are, and how dangerous to democracy, the underpinnings of democracy, the things that they do are. And when this came out, previously there was really no information whatsoever in the public space about these firms and about their relationships to the FBI, to the Pentagon, to the NSA in some cases. And now suddenly there were. Suddenly we had a huge trove of information, sort of a map of this industry and of its interface with the U.S. government. And that was a huge problem for them. And it was because of that. It was because of our continued work in getting more materials and analyzing existing materials and writing about them and trying to get other journalists interested. That's what set off both the UK and the US. We were now threatening them in a way because any state in the modern age cannot survive without a degree of illicit secrecy. Because no state in the modern age, no major state, refrains from engaging in criminal and deleterious behavior on an ongoing basis. And so we were striking, without really knowing it fully ourselves, at the very basis of modern, let's say, imperialist government. And so that explains, I think, better than anything else, why it was that I was facing 105 years worth of charges a year afterwards. And that explains why my search warrants that were first executed before I was arrested listed these very firms that we'd exposed as subjects for search, and why it listed my group, Project PM, which helps to crowdsource, just go through these emails that our friends at Anonymous acquired for us. That's why it listed our website as subjects for search. This was, that was the key issue here. It wasn't that they were. That's a part about Anonymous. That's the aspect of hacktivism that ensured that we were all going to be charged with a series of ludicrous charges and prosecuted in illicit ways that are even unusual for the broken U.S. American justice system. So in my case, as is now I think fairly well known, I was charged primarily, eventually, for having copied and pasted a link that had been dropped in by an anonymous hacker into an anonymous chat room. The link was, my understanding was that it was leads to some of the emails that they just acquired, that it was entirely legal for me to go through. And so I copied that link, pasted it in my Project PM IRC, Internet Relay Chat Room. And that resulted in 11 counts of aggravated identity theft. Because the link actually ended up going to a file with credit card numbers for the customers of this firm, Strat firm, which is very similar in aspect to the HB Gary and these other firms we've been discussing. And I was charged a number of other related crimes as well. And that obviously, I was lucky that they charged me with that particular crime because the implications of that were very frightening to anyone who understood the internet. So this was the first time, in my understanding, the understanding I think of most people who have looked at this, that the federal government of the United States has said that you can be charged with serious crimes simply for linking to something, linking to publicly available material. In my case, I mean, the chat transcript was so clear that I had no intention of leading to credit card numbers, that it was rather somewhat absurd that they resorted to those charges. And they knew that. In fact, they had to drop the charges, luckily, eventually, because it didn't even fall into the statute. The statute they charged me with was for identity theft. And credit card numbers, contrary to the statute, are not yet government-issued IDs in this country. And give it 5-10 years, they will be. But right now, it hasn't quite come to that. So my case was great in a lot of ways because it illustrated so much about the U.S. justice system. It gave the press another chance to look at some of the things that we had uncovered that they had not quite understood the first time around, and aspects of how this works, the way that activists and whistleblowers are dealt with by the U.S. and by similar governments of similar outlook, like the UK, these all sort of suddenly came to the fore in ways that they previously had not. Now, shortly after I was arrested, Aaron Swartz, an American who was very heavily involved in some ingenious internet products, services, involved with the creation of Reddit, for instance. He had been charged by Carmen Ortiz, a prosecutor up in the Northeast, with having downloaded from his MIT university accounts some large number of scientific papers that had been created, these papers, with the public's money, public funding, but were nonetheless not available to the public unless they paid for them, which they had. They had paid for the underlying science, the underlying research. So he thought that was wrong, quite correctly, and he downloaded the entirety of those, released them for free to everyone, and then was charged with 20 years in prison. Now, the prosecutor, in her defense, later said that, well, he could have easily pled to 2 years. I mean, we please people out all the time. He didn't have to face 20 years in prison. He just has to plea. And that, of course, brought attention to the fact mentioned earlier, I think by Mustafa, that, or perhaps it was by Lauri, that some 98% of American defendants plea. And they plea because they are generally it's either plea or roll the dice and go before a system in which FBI agents are allowed to lie, essentially, in which prosecutors are expected to withhold evidence. And so people plea. And Aaron Swartz, apparently, to his credit, one doesn't really know much about what goes through someone's mind. One can assume that the prosecution had some impact on his well-being and his mentality, but he did commit suicide. And that too, for what it's worth, helped, I think, to get people to understand how vastly uncivilized our justice system is. And this was something that I took pains to mention during Lauri Love's case when I went on the BBC 6 months ago or so. Naturally, they introduced me as a hacker on the BBC when I came on, which even a lot of bad U.S. outlets don't do anymore. I take pains to mention to the British people in general that they tend to think of the U.S. justice system as being very close to theirs, its spirit. And that's understandable because, of course, we derive our jurisprudence directly from the British system. But the fact is, and this is something that's illustrated in the great disparities between what ended up happening to the hackers in England, not just Jake and Mustafa, but a few others involved, Anonymous and other things, compared to what happens to myself and to Jeremy Hammond, a U.S. hacker who's still in prison. It's such a vastly different. I mean, of all the horrific things you've heard Jake and Mustafa and Lauri talk about so eloquently in the past few years, and you're here today. It's just so much vastly worse in America. This is a larger issue than whistleblowing. It's a larger issue than hacktivism. It's something it's gotten so bad that it's even noticed in the U.S. press. It's noticed by Congress. No serious person will actually argue that the justice system here works really well. It's gotten to that point, and that's good. And so, aside from all the things I think we've done as a public service in terms of exposing very dangerous aspects of the intelligence community and the privatized intelligence community, and some of these technologies that I'm quite obsessed with, like persona management, which allows for propaganda, disinformation on a much more sophisticated basis than even Stalin could have ever hoped for. I think this larger aspect here, I think if the only result of everything we've done was to bring attention to how criminalized are the institutions that are being allowed to determine who is and isn't a criminal, I think that would be enough. I think that's a major factor, a fundamental step in getting moderate, just everyday people to understand what a government is and what a government can be if it's not properly curated by engaged, duty-bound citizens. And so we have a number of issues sort of intersecting here. One of them, to me, my greatest concern for the past 7 or 8 years since this stuff came out, since we first started looking at these things, is that the disinformation and propaganda industries are proliferating. They are increasing in capability and stature behind the scenes in a very opaque way that makes it all more dangerous, because when you have a sector working with a great amount of resources, great deal of expertise, protection by the state to the extent that even when they get caught committing crimes, as H.B. Gary and them did, they don't get prosecuted, but rather the exposers get prosecuted. That's a very dangerous situation. It goes beyond most dangers. It's not just dangerous like a car crashes or contaminated water. It's something. It's a fundamentally dangerous thing. It strikes at information. It thus strikes at our ability to solve any problem, to address any problem, to assess reality. These technologies, and so the fact that even when we expose them, and even then go to prison for them, these things sort of just float in and out of the consciousness of the press. That to me is one of the great frightening aspects of the age we live in. That it doesn't seem to matter sometimes how good we do and how much we fight to bring these things to attention. It just doesn't quite take. And so that's why, all these years later, I'm still very convinced. I obviously have not gotten less militant by virtue of having a SWAT team break into my apartment with automatic weapons and take me off to prison and charge me with trumped-up charges.
Thank you, Barrett. I'm aware that we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'd like us just to give people an opportunity to ask a question. Yellow, if you want to.
I mean, just to reiterate, we've just heard these 3 very detailed accounts about the legal challenges that people face. And they're very tough, and they're very tough to maneuver. But I'll just go back to, is there support from the community? What's the perception of these actors? And the metaphors we use in our writing, whether it's the dark web, which I think can be very problematic for encryption, to how we frame these actors really, really matter. So that was what I talked about. I don't need to say anything more, so let's just open it up to questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to take 3 questions. If you keep it brief, that would be great, because our time is limited.
Hi, thanks very much to all the panelists. That was absolutely fascinating. I think it's really sort of changed my perception a lot on Anonymous, which I tend to remember as being something that comes out of 4chan, a very toxic environment, especially for women, and which I more readily, until this point, associated with something like Gamergate, which has been about largely the persecution of journalists and programmers for daring to discuss computer games whilst in possession of a vagina. There has been a lot of things to do with doxing, which it seems like hasn't been, kind of the people who were responsible for that sort of thing have not been subjected to the kind of appalling treatment by the state that you guys have for engaging in the kind of activism which I see as much more legitimate. And sort of I have 2 questions. Firstly, I'd like to hear your comments on that. And secondly, I'd like to know a bit more about how we got from this point of being in this, as I say, this quite toxic forum, which is not really associated with this kind of what I consider to be legit political work, and the stuff that you're talking about, which, as I say, seems to be a lot more right on and the sort of thing I would support.
Brilliant, got it. There's actually a lot of interest on the panel in answering that point, so let's stay there.
Can I rapid fire?
You better rapid fire.
I'll just speak incredibly quickly. Okay, so it did come from a trolling culture. It came from a nihilistic, let's fuck things up because we can and it's funny. What happened is people were able to find an intersection of that mentality with something that people cared about offline, which was the Church of Scientology. And the Church of Scientology had a war on the internet since time immemorial. It's an abusive cult, and people found a way to troll them. And that created a segue into activism, and Anonymous grew out of that initial action, and it started to take on concerns, anti-authoritarian concerns, libertarian concerns, as in freedom and rights on the internet. And then you rightly mentioned that there is this toxic Gamergate kind of mentality, and now there is this alt-right that has emerged. And I want to put forward a thesis that what happens is vested powerful interest in the US government and some private interests decided that this anti-authoritarian tendency, this subculture, this counterculture on the internet was posing a threat to them, to their power, and they instituted a COINTELPRO style program to cut off the heads. Barrett, cut off Jake, cut off me, heads, and as a consequence of that, there was a diffusion of the energy of Anonymous that was channeling this trolling, this disaffection, this alienation from society into something progressive, into something based on justice. It created a lacuna and a vacuum that has been seized by far-right hateful, ethno-nationalist, racist, misogynistic elements, and now is being successfully steered, I would conjecture, by intelligence services that are antithetical to Western values. And that is a consequence of them deciding that they did not want people fighting for justice using the internet. That scared them more than, as you say, horrible, hateful mentalities spreading using those same forums. And that's something we need to fix and address.
Thank you, Lauri. Biella.
No, I mean, I wrote a whole book that really looked at the transformation from trolling culture to the progressive wing of Anonymous, which was a little bit accidental in many ways, precisely because it was a pretty toxic culture. But at a certain point around 2011 and 12, there really wasn't that much of a kind of a relationship between Anonymous and 4chan anymore, and people were hacking, they were on IRC, but that kind of troll culture continued, and because of Gamergate and some of the kind of forces that Lauri's talking about, there was another trajectory. So he stated it all. The frustrating thing is actually some journalists and others who've written about it have just kind of lumped everything together. And the historical stakes matter, right? People went to jail. People went to jail because of their progressive politics. And there were these two trajectories, and there was a lot of writing that just simply collapsed them. And that is where I'm just going to end.
Actually, I will add one thing to that quickly.
Go on.
So when Anonymous became this thing that was more about activism than just trolling, or this internet hate machine, as Fox News calls it, like 4chan was actually pissed off about that. Like there was actually campaigns by this more toxic part of the of the kind of community to actually try to not to unsteer Anonymous from taking onto this form of this activist group. So like
we'd be referred to as moral and then an F word that I won't repeat because it's a slur.
Yeah, so like one thing that they did, the trolls did to try to discredit the people who were trying to steer Anonymous to a more activist direction. They like put like gifs of like elliptic gifs that trigger epilepsy in this forum that was designed for people who were suffering from epilepsy.
There was more questions. I saw a lady.
Yeah.
Let's wait for a mic. There's a mic coming. It's important to get the questions on video. Yeah.
No. How are we doing for time?
I just wanted to say one thing. It is so important what you say about how criminal.
We have 2 minutes, so you want a reaction, keep it very, very short.
I want to reiterate, I said there are people far more astute than me. They're working with the Secret Services or the MOD or the intelligence, so they can speak up and say how criminalized these institutions are. This is a carryover from the thing before, Paradise Papers. There's a guy called Thomas Piketty.
What's the question?
He's doing. It is that you guys have to know that this is not new. There are people sitting here in the audience.
Okay.
It is their job to lie, to cheat, to steal, and that the bankers, the president of France should have been DSK.
Okay.
The presidents belong in jail, so you're telling us something we know from generations, but you have to keep ramming that home.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
I do hope that the people that speak up, because you guys are doing this.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think that's. I think we've run out of time on the clock. Thank you for listening. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank Lauri and Mustafa and Barrett and Biella.
We're sorry Barrett can't be here. By the way, we wish he could have come in person. And it's also worth mentioning there was a media blackout in his case, and they haven't tried that yet in the UK, but they may try it in future when prosecuting hackers, say that you guys can't be involved. Actually, they did. They tried to deny the grounds in one of my cases. So
they did indeed try in your case.
You need to push back against that and cover these cases, and don't lose sight of them. For instance, Marcus Hutchins and other people that are still in prison and other hacktivists that may be going to prison. Stay attentive because we need that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.